Picture a magnificent Victorian mansion, towering stone walls, gleaming chandeliers, lavish dining rooms filled with silver and crystal, wealthy families dressed in elegant clothing, enjoying extravagant dinners beneath the warm glow of candlelight. To anyone looking from the outside, these homes appeared to be symbols of success, sophistication, and comfort. But behind every polished floor, every perfectly prepared meal, and every luxurious room was an army of invisible workers, people whose names were rarely remembered, people whose stories were almost never told, people who spent their lives serving others while remaining hidden in the shadows. This is their story, the story of Victorian servants, a story of sacrifice, a story of hardship, and a story that history largely forgot. In 19th century Britain, the Victorian era became one of the most powerful periods in the nation's history. Factories expanded across cities, railways connected distant towns, trade brought enormous wealth. The British Empire stretched across much of the globe. For the wealthy, these changes created opportunities unlike anything seen before. Grand country estates and urban mansions became symbols of status. The richer a family became, the more servants they employed. Having servants was not simply practical. It was a sign of social standing. A family with one servant could be considered comfortable. A family with 10 servants was wealthy. A family with 20 or more servants was among the elite. Some aristocratic households employed dozens of workers. In the largest estates, the number could exceed 50. Every aspect of daily life depended on these workers. Meals did not prepare themselves. Clothes did not wash themselves. Fireplaces did not clean themselves. Yet Victorian society often acted as if servants barely existed. Their labor was everywhere. Their presence was nowhere. Imagine arriving at a grand mansion in London during the late 1800s. A horse-drawn carriage stops at the entrance. Guests step out wearing expensive gowns and tailored suits. A servant immediately opens the door. Another takes coats and hats. Another prepares refreshments. Another lights lamps throughout the house. Several more work unseen in kitchens below. The guests notice the luxury. They admire the home. But they rarely think about the people making everything possible. The servants were expected to blend into the background. The ideal servant was almost invisible, efficient, silent, obedient. Unnoticed, the less attention they attracted, the more successful they were considered. For many wealthy families, servants represented convenience. For servants themselves, service often represented survival. Most servants came from poor backgrounds. Their families struggled to afford food, clothing, and shelter. Employment opportunities were limited. Education was often minimal. Many children left school at an early age. Some never attended regularly at all. When families faced financial hardship, sending a child into service became a practical decision. The wages were small, but they were better than nothing. A servant usually received food and accommodation. For poor households, that alone could make a significant difference. By the late Victorian period, domestic service had become one of the largest employers in Britain. Hundreds of thousands of women worked as servants. In fact, service became one of the most common occupations available to young women. Many entered service before reaching adulthood. Some were barely teenagers. Their childhood ended the moment they crossed the threshold of a wealthy household. Let us imagine one such girl. Her name could have been Mary, or Sarah, or Elizabeth. History rarely recorded these details, but her story was repeated countless times. She is 13 years old. Her father works irregular jobs. Her mother struggles to feed several children. Money is constantly scarce. One day, an opportunity appears. A position as a kitchen maid in a large house. The wage is small, the hours are long, the work is exhausting. Yet her family cannot refuse. They need the income, and so she leaves home. Perhaps for the first time in her life, she carries a small bundle of belongings, a few clothes, a family photograph, maybe a treasured letter. As she walks away, she does not know when she will return. The mansion ahead seems enormous, intimidating, almost like another world. In many ways, it is. The Victorian household operated according to strict hierarchy. Just as society was divided into classes, so too was the servant workforce. At the very top stood the butler. The butler managed male servants and supervised many household operations. He represented authority below the master of the house. Next came the housekeeper. She oversaw female servants and maintained household standards. Both positions carried significant responsibility. Below them existed a complex system of ranks. Valets attended gentlemen. Ladies' maids attended wealthy women. Footmen served guests and performed various duties. Cooks managed kitchens. Kitchen maids assisted cooks. Housemaids cleaned rooms. Scullery maids performed some of the most unpleasant tasks. Every servant had a place. Every servant had responsibilities. Every servant knew exactly where they stood. Advancement was possible. But it was not easy. Many remained at the bottom for years. Some never escaped it. The hierarchy shaped daily life. Even among servants, status mattered. A cook might consider herself superior to a scullery maid. A housekeeper possessed authority over numerous workers. The servant world mirrored the class divisions of Victorian society itself. Power flowed downward. Obedience flowed upward. Questioning authority was rarely tolerated. Mistakes could bring punishment. Disobedience could bring dismissal. And dismissal could mean disaster. Losing employment often meant losing housing as well. A servant who lost her position could suddenly find herself homeless. The fear of unemployment remained constant. It influenced every decision, every conversation, every action. Many modern people imagine servants spending their days interacting with wealthy families. The reality was often very different. Servants were deliberately separated from their employers. Large homes contained servant corridors, back staircases, basement work areas, high passageways. Architects designed these features specifically to keep servants out of sight. The wealthy family occupied one world, the servants occupied another. The two worlds existed under the same roof, yet they rarely mixed. A maid could clean a bedroom every day and still know very little about the people sleeping there. Distant maintained social order, vivid threatened it. The emotional consequences were profound. Many servants experienced loneliness. They lived far from family, worked long hours, and possessed little free time. Letters became precious connections to home. Receiving a letter from parents or siblings could transform an entire week. Some servants reread letters repeatedly. Others kept them hidden among personal belongings, small reminders of a life left behind. Homesickness was common, but expressing it openly was not always acceptable. Work came first. Feelings came second. At least that was the expectation. Meanwhile, upstairs life continued comfortably. Breakfast appeared on time. Rooms remained spotless. Laundry returned clean and pressed. Dinner parties unfolded flawlessly. Guests admired elegance. They complimented hospitality. They celebrated refinement. Yet few considered the effort required to create these experiences. Behind every polished surface stood hours of labor. Behind every successful event stood exhausted workers. Their contribution remained largely invisible. Success belonged to the household. The work belonged to the servants. Victorian society often praised hard work, but recognition was unevenly distributed. Industrialists received admiration, politicians received attention, inventors became famous, servants rarely received any of these rewards. Even though their labor supported the daily lives of millions, historical records frequently focus on wealthy families, their possessions, their achievements, their scandals, their lifestyles. Meanwhile, servants appear only briefly, a name in a census, a reference in household accounts, a mention in a diary, fragments, tiny glimpses into lives spent largely unnoticed. Yet, those lives mattered. Without servants, many Victorian households could not have functioned. The grand homes celebrated in books and films depended entirely upon their labor. The luxurious image of Victorian society rested on foundations built by workers whose stories were often ignored. They lit the fires before dawn, they cleaned the rooms, they prepared the meals, they carried water, they polished silver, they washed clothes, they answered bells, they performed countless tasks that kept households running, day after day, year after year, often without recognition, often without thanks. As darkness settled over a Victorian mansion, guests might retire to comfortable bedrooms. Candles flickered softly, the house became quiet. But for many servants, the day was not yet finished. There were still fires to manage, rooms to prepare, tasks to complete, and tomorrow would begin again before sunrise. The cycle never truly stopped. For the wealthy, the mansion represented comfort. For servants, it represented work, relentless, demanding, endless work. And for many young servants entering this hidden world, the hardest challenges were only beginning. Narration, script. For many Victorian servants, the journey did not begin with a job. It began with poverty, long before they entered a grand mansion. Long before they learned how to polish silver or serve dinner. They were simply children trying to survive in a world that offered them very few choices. In Victorian Britain, childhood looked very different from what most people imagine today. For wealthy families, childhood could be a time of education, comfort, and opportunity. For the poor, childhood was often short. Many children learned from an early age that survival required work. Families struggled to afford food. Rent consumed precious income. Illness could destroy a household's finances overnight. If a father became injured or lost employment, the entire family suffered. There were few safety nets, few protections, and very little help. Every family member was expected to contribute, even children. Imagine a small house in a crowded industrial city. The air smells of coal smoke. The streets outside are muddy and crowded. Several children share a single room. Food is limited. Every meal matters. A young girl sits quietly beside her mother. She is 12 years old, perhaps 13. She dreams of a better future. But dreams do not fill empty stomachs. Her parents know something difficult must happen. Soon, she will leave home, not because she wants to, because the family needs her wages. Across Britain, this scene repeated itself thousands of times. Domestic service became one of the few occupations available to young girls. Employers preferred young workers. They were easier to train, less likely to challenge authority, and willing to accept lower wages. As a result, many servants entered employment during their early teenage years. Some were younger. For these children, service represented a doorway into adulthood. But it was an adulthood filled with responsibilities most modern teenagers could hardly imagine. The day of departure was often emotional. Families understood what it meant. A daughter leaving for service might not return home often. Travel could be expensive. Time off was limited. This created separation. Many parents worried constantly. Many children felt terrified, yet there was little alternative. Poverty left few choices. A girl might carry her belongings in a small bag, a spare dress, a comb, a Bible, perhaps a photograph, perhaps a treasured keepsake from home. These simple possessions often became her entire world. As she walked away, she left behind everything familiar. Her family, her friends, her neighborhood, her childhood. The journey to a wealthy household could feel overwhelming. Large mansions seemed enormous compared to modest working-class homes. Their stone walls towered above visitors. Their rooms appeared endless. Their staircases seemed grander than anything poor children had ever seen. Many young servants felt intimidated from the moment they arrived. Every detail reminded them that they were entering a different social world, a world governed by rules they barely understood. Their first days were often frightening. New servants had much to learn. Every household operated differently. Every employer had expectations. Mistakes were common, and mistakes could be costly. Young servants quickly discovered that perfection was expected. Beds had to be made correctly. Floors had to be spotless. Uniforms had to remain clean. Instructions had to be followed exactly. There was little room for error. For many children, the greatest challenge was loneliness. The mansion might contain dozens of people, yet they often felt completely alone. Their families were far away. The familiar sounds of home disappeared. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by strangers. New rules, new routines, new responsibilities. Everything changed at once. Some cried themselves to sleep. Others hid their emotions. Many simply endured. Letters became lifelines, whenever possible. Servants wrote home. A single letter could provide comfort during difficult weeks. Concurrents wanted reassurance. Children wanted connection. The arrival of mail brought excitement. For a few precious moments, distance seemed smaller. The words on the page reminded them they had not been forgotten. But letters also carried sadness. Reading about family events they could not attend often deepened homesickness. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Life continued without them. The youngest servants usually received the hardest and least respected jobs. Among them were scullery maids. These girls occupied the lowest positions in many households. Their work began before sunrise. It often ended long after dark. They scrubbed pots, cleaned kitchen floors, carried water, washed dishes, disposed of waste. The work was exhausting, dirty, and physically demanding. Yet someone had to do it, and that someone was usually the youngest servant. A scullery maid might spend hours standing in cold water. Her hands became rough and cracked. Her back ached constantly. She rarely received praise. Most household members barely noticed her existence. She worked behind the scenes, hidden from guests and employers alike. Despite this, her labor remained essential. Without workers like her, the household could not function. As children adapted to service, they learned important lessons about Victorian society. They learned where they belonged, or rather, where society believed they belonged. Class divisions surrounded them everywhere. The difference between servant and employer extended far beyond money. It shaped behavior, speech, clothing, opportunities, even expectations for the future. Many young servants understood that their lives would likely remain very different from the lives of those they served. Education opportunities were limited. Some servants entered employment before completing school. Once work began, learning often stopped. Long hours left little time for study. Books became luxuries, lessons became memories. The possibility of advancement through education faded. Many accepted this reality because they had no choice. Work came first. Always. Yet despite these hardships, many servants demonstrated remarkable resilience. They adapted, they learned, they survived. Some eventually earned promotions. A kitchen maid might become a cook. A housemaid might become a lady's maid. Years of experience could improve one's position. These promotions offered slightly higher wages and greater respect, but advancement required patience, and patience required endurance. Not every story ended well. Some children struggled terribly. Some left service after only a short time. Others were dismissed. A few ran away. The emotional pressure proved too much. The physical demands overwhelmed them. The isolation became unbearable. Victorian records contain countless examples of young servants facing challenges far beyond their years. Their experiences remind us that behind the polished image of Victorian households stood real people carrying very real burdens. As weeks turned into months, many children slowly transformed into experienced servants. They became familiar with routines. They learned household expectations. They mastered difficult tasks. What once seemed impossible gradually became normal. But normalization did not make life easy. It simply taught them how to endure. For wealthy families, servants appeared dependable, efficient, professional. But beneath those polished appearances were young people who had sacrificed much. They had sacrificed childhood, time with family, opportunities for education, moments of freedom. They had entered adulthood early because circumstances demanded it, not because they chose it. As evening settled over the mansion, a young servant might pause briefly beside a window. Outside, the world continued moving. Families gathered around dinner tables. Children played in the streets. Life carried on. For a moment, she might remember home. The sound of her mother's voice, the warmth of familiar faces, the simple comfort of belonging somewhere. Then a bell would ring. Another task awaited, and the moment would disappear, because in Victorian service, duty always came first, no matter how young you were, no matter how tired you felt, no matter how much you missed home. The children who entered service hoped life might improve with time, but they were about to discover the true reality of servant life. A world of endless labor, steady discipline, and rules that governed nearly every moment of the day. When most people imagine Victorian servants, they often picture neatly dressed maids carrying trays through elegant hallways. What they rarely imagine is where those servants slept, what they ate, how they survived, or how much suffering existed behind the polished image of Victorian service. Because, while wealthy families enjoyed comfort and luxury, the people who made that comfort possible often lived very different lives. Lives filled with exhaustion, lives filled with sacrifice, and sometimes lives filled with silent misery. Every morning before the household awoke, servants were already at work. The rich family would wake to warm rooms, clean clothing, and breakfast waiting downstairs. But servants had often been awake for hours. Many rose before dawn, some even earlier during winter. Their work started long before anyone saw them, and by the end of the day, they would be the last people still awake. This demanding routine left very little time for rest. Sea leave became a luxury many servants could never fully enjoy. The sleeping quarters of servants were rarely comfortable. In large country houses, servants usually lived in attics, basements, or hidden sections of the building. These rooms were designed for practicality, not comfort. They were often small, cold during winter, hot during summer, poorly ventilated, and overcrowded. A wealthy family might occupy spacious bedrooms decorated with expensive furniture. Meanwhile, several servants could be sharing a cramped room upstairs. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Imagine climbing several narrow flights of stairs. After 16 hours of work, your feet ache, your back hurts, your hands are sore from scrubbing and cleaning. You finally reach your room. The bed is simple, the mattress is thin, the room is cold. Tomorrow, you must wake before sunrise and do it all again. For countless servants, this was everyday life. Not for a week, not for a month, for years. Privacy barely existed. Servants rarely had personal space. Their life was constantly supervised. Even in servant quarters, rules remained strict. Behavior was monitored. Conversations could be overheard. Mistakes could spread quickly through household gossip. A servant was never completely free, even during rare moments of rest. Food represented another major difference between employers and servants. Victorian dining rooms displayed extraordinary wealth. Guests enjoyed multiple courses, roasted meats, fresh vegetables, delicate desserts, fine wines. Luxury appeared everywhere. But downstairs, servants often ate very differently. The exact quality of food depended on the household. Some employers treated servants reasonably well, others did not. In many homes, servants received simpler meals prepared separately from the family's dining experience. Leftovers frequently appeared on servant tables. Food that remained untouched upstairs might become dinner downstairs. While this prevented waste, it also reinforced social divisions. The message was clear. The best food belonged to the family. The rest belonged to the servants. Meals were often eaten quickly. Work schedules left little time for relaxation. A servant might spend hours preparing food she would never taste. She might carry elegant dishes into the dining room, only to return downstairs and eat something entirely different. The contrast could be painful, especially for servants who spent every day surrounded by wealth they would never possess. Physical health suffered under these conditions. Long hours and demanding labor placed enormous strain on the body. Many servants experienced chronic pain. Back injuries were common. Knee problems developed from endless stair climbing. Hands became rough and damaged from cleaning chemicals and hot water. Fatigue became a constant companion. Some servants felt exhausted almost every day of their working lives. The kitchen could be particularly dangerous. Victorian kitchens contained large stoves, open flames, boiling water, heavy pots, sharp tools. Accidents happened regularly. Burns were common, cuts occurred frequently. Some injuries healed, others left permanent scars. Yet many servants continued working despite pain. Missing work could threaten employment, and losing employment threatened survival. Medical care was often difficult to obtain. Poor workers rarely enjoyed the health care available to wealthy families. Even minor illnesses could become serious. Respiratory problems affected many servants. Coal fires filled homes with smoke and soot. Poor ventilation created unhealthy environments. Tuberculosis, one of the deadliest diseases of the Victorian era, spread through crowded living conditions. For servants, sickness often brought fear, not only fear of illness itself, but fear of losing their position. The emotional burden could be just as heavy as the physical one. Many servants experienced loneliness throughout their careers. They lived among people but rarely felt included. The family upstairs depended on their work, yet often knew little about their personal lives. A servant could spend years in a household and still feel invisible. Loneliness became especially difficult during holidays. Christmas, birthdays, and family celebrations reminded servants of what they were missing. While employers gathered with loved ones, servants continued working. Some received a few hours of free time. Others received none at all. The feeling of separation never completely disappeared. Friendships among servants became extremely important. In many cases, fellow servants provided the only emotional support available. They shared experiences, shared frustrations, shared hopes. A conversation after a long day could provide comfort. A kind word could make difficult circumstances easier to endure. These friendships often helped servants survive emotionally. Yet, even friendships carried risks. Victorian households expected discipline. Too much conversation could be viewed as laziness. Too much laughter might be considered unprofessional. Servants learned to balance human connection with strict expectations. Every action existed under the shadow of authority. Relationships presented additional challenges. Many employers discouraged romance among servants. Marriage created complications. A married servant might leave employment. Pregnancy often ended a woman's career in domestic service. As a result, some servants postponed relationships for years, others sacrificed them entirely. The demands of work left little room for personal happiness. Imagine being a young woman in your 20s. You spend nearly every waking hour serving others. You rarely leave the household. You possess little privacy, little freedom, little opportunity to build a future of your own. For many servants, this was reality. Their best years often belonged to someone else's household, not to themselves. Some dreamed of saving enough money to open a small business. Others hoped to marry. Some simply wanted a stable life. But dreams were difficult to achieve when wages remained low and opportunities remained limited. Many servants spent decades working with little chance of significant change. Despite these hardships, they continued. They cleaned, cooked, washed, polished, carried, served day after day, year after year. Their labor kept Victorian households functioning. Yet society rarely acknowledged their sacrifices. History often overlooked their struggles. The grand houses survived. The servant stories faded. As night settled over another Victorian mansion, servants quietly completed their final tasks. The family upstairs prepared for sleep. The house grew silent. Candles dimmed, doors closed. And somewhere in a small attic room, a tired servant lay awake, thinking about home, thinking about tomorrow, thinking about a future that remained uncertain. Outside, the world celebrated Victorian prosperity. Inside, countless servants carried burdens few people ever noticed, and the greatest tragedy was not simply their suffering. It was how easily society forgot it. Narration script: history remembers kings. History remembers queens. History remembers generals, inventors, politicians, and industrialists. Their names fill books. Their portraits hang in museums. Their achievements are studied for generations. But history does not always remember the people who made their lives possible. The workers, the laborers, the servants, the people who spent their lives behind the scenes. And among the most forgotten of them were the Victorian servants. For decades they cleaned the homes, cooked the meals, lit the fires, raised the children, maintained the lifestyles of Britain's wealthiest families. Yet when history was written, many of their stories disappeared. Imagine walking through a grand Victorian mansion today. Visitors admire elegant furniture, beautiful paintings, magnificent dining rooms, sparkling chandeliers. Guides often explain which wealthy family lived there, what important guests visited, how much money they possessed. But far less attention is given to the servants, who kept everything running. The people who woke before sunrise, the people who worked until exhaustion, the people whose labor created the luxury visitors admire. Without them, these houses could never have functioned. Yet their names are rarely remembered. One reason for this silence is simple. Servants left behind fewer records. The wealthy wrote letters, published books, owned property, appeared in newspapers. Their lives generated documents that survived for generations. Servants often had none of these advantages. Many left only small traces, a census entry, a payroll record, a mention in someone else's diary, tiny fragments of a life. As a result, countless servant stories vanished, entire lifetimes reduced to a single line in an old document. A young maid who spent 40 years working, a cook who prepared thousands of meals, a housemaid who sacrificed her youth to support her family. Their contributions mattered enormously, but history often looked the other way. Yet when historians began examining Victorian society more closely, an astonishing truth emerged. Servants were everywhere. By the late 19th century, domestic service employed more women than almost any other occupation in Britain. Hundreds of thousands worked in private households. Some estimates placed the number above 1 million. This meant that behind every elegant neighborhood stood an invisible workforce, a workforce larger than many industries. A workforce essential to Victorian life, and yet society rarely celebrated them. Servants were expected to disappear into the background, to be useful but unnoticed, present but invisible. The ideal servant was someone nobody talked about, someone who performed every task perfectly while attracting no attention. Ironically, the better they performed their jobs, the easier they became to forget. As the 20th century approached, change slowly arrived. New technologies began transforming daily life. Electric lighting appeared. Vacuum cleaners emerged. Modern appliances reduced household labor. Social attitudes also changed. Young people gained new employment opportunities. Factories, shops, offices, schools. For many workers, domestic service no longer represented the only path available. Gradually, the servant population declined. The great Victorian servant system began to fade. Large households found it harder to recruit workers. Maintaining enormous staffs became increasingly expensive. Many grand homes reduced the number of servants they employed. Some households disappeared entirely. The world was changing, and with it, the servant era slowly came to an end. But what happened to the servants themselves? The answer varied. Some remained in service for most of their lives. Others married and started families. Some moved into different occupations. A few achieved financial stability. Many did not. The reality was often complicated. There was no single ending. Only thousands of individual stories, thousands of lives shaped by hard work and sacrifice. Consider the young girl we imagined at the beginning of this documentary. The 13-year-old who left home, carrying a small bundle of belongings. What became of her? Perhaps she remained in service for decades. Perhaps she became a respected housekeeper. Perhaps she married and left domestic work behind. Perhaps she struggled throughout her life. We may never know, because history rarely recorded the ending. And that uncertainty reflects the experience of countless real servants. Their lives mattered, but society often failed to preserve their stories. Today, when we look back at Victorian England, it is easy to focus on wealth, luxury, architecture, fashion, the glamour of the era. But doing so risks missing a deeper truth. Every polished floor had been scrubbed by someone. Every elegant dinner had been prepared by someone. Every magnificent household depended on workers whose names were often forgotten. The Victorian world did not run on wealth alone. It ran on labor, and much of that labor came from servants. Their story is not merely a story about the past. It is also a reminder about the present. Throughout history, societies have often celebrated those at the top, while overlooking those who support them. The people who work quietly. The people who keep systems functioning. The people whose contributions remain unseen. Victorian servants remind us that history is not only made by famous individuals, it is also made by ordinary people. People whose work shapes the world, even when their names are forgotten. Perhaps that is why their story still matters, because behind every statistic was a human being, a daughter, a son, a sister, a brother, someone with dreams, fears, hopes, and struggles, someone who deserved to be remembered. Imagine one final evening in a Victorian mansion. The family has gone to bed, the candles burn low, the hallways are quiet. Outside, the wind moves softly through the darkness. Downstairs, servant finishes the last task of the day. A floor is swept, a fire is checked, a door is locked. Tomorrow the routine will begin again. Before sunrise, before the household wakes, before anyone notices, just as it always has. For years, for decades, for generations, millions of servants lived lives like this. Lives built on duty, lives built on endurance, lives built on sacrifice. They asked for little, received little recognition, and left behind only faint traces of their existence. Yet without them, Victorian society could not have functioned. Without them, the grand houses would have stood silent. Without them, the luxury so often celebrated would never have been possible. And so, as we close this story, perhaps the most important lesson is this. The true measure of a society is not only found in its palaces, its wealth, or its famous names. It is also found in the lives of ordinary people, the people history almost forgot. The people who worked in silence, the people who carried the weight of an era upon their shoulders, the Victorian servants, forgotten by many, but forgotten no longer. Thank you for watching. For many Victorian servants, the hardest part of their lives was not the endless work. It was not the long hours. It was not even the exhaustion. The hardest part was something far more painful, the feeling that nobody cared, that their suffering existed behind closed doors, hid from the world, ignored by society, and sometimes even ignored by history itself. Victorian England was obsessed with appearances. A wealthy family needed to look respectable. Their home needed to appear perfect. Their reputation needed to remain untouched. Everything was carefully controlled. Everything was carefully presented. But beneath that polished image, reality was often very different. Because the comfort enjoyed upstairs was frequently built upon hardship downstairs. Many servants lived under constant pressure. One mistake could change everything. A broken plate, a stained dress, a missed instruction. Something as small as these mistakes could lead to punishment. Sometimes wages were reduced. Sometimes privileges were removed. Sometimes servants lost their jobs entirely. The fear of dismissal followed them every day. For wealthy employers, finding another servant was often possible. For servants, finding another position was never guaranteed. A poor reference could destroy future opportunities. A single employer's criticism might follow a servant for years. This gave employers enormous power, power that was not always used fairly. Some households treated servants with kindness, but others did not. Historical records contain stories of harsh treatment, humiliation, verbal abuse, and constant criticism. Servants were expected to endure these experiences quietly. Complaining could be dangerous. Speaking out could cost them everything. Imagine spending years in a house where every action is judged, every movement watched, every mistake remembered. The emotional burden would be enormous, and for many servants it was. Some suffered anxiety, some experienced depression, though Victorian society rarely used those terms. mental suffering often remained invisible, just like the servants themselves. Women faced particular challenges. Most domestic servants were female. They worked in environments where power belonged almost entirely to others. Their employers controlled their wages, their schedules, their housing, and often their futures. This imbalance created situations where servants had very little protection. Many young women entered service hoping to improve their lives. Some succeeded, many did not. Years passed quickly. A servant might spend her youth caring for another family's children, cleaning another family's rooms, cooking another family's meals, only to discover that little had changed in her own circumstances. And yet, despite everything, many servants displayed extraordinary strength that rarely appears in history books. They adapted to difficult conditions, supported their families, survived economic hardship, and continued working through challenges that would overwhelm many people today. Their resilience shaped Victorian society. Without servants, the famous Victorian lifestyle could never have existed. The grand parties, the luxurious homes, the elegant dinners, none of it would have been possible without the labor of countless workers. Workers who received little recognition, workers whose stories were pushed into the background. Today, when we admire Victorian architecture or watch dramas set in grand country houses, it is easy to focus on the wealthy families, but behind every grand staircase stood a maid carrying coal. Behind every elegant dining room stood exhausted kitchen workers. Behind every comfortable bedroom stood someone who had spent hours preparing it. The true story of Victorian England belongs to them as much as anyone else. Perhaps that is why these forgotten lives deserve to be remembered. Not because they were famous, not because they were powerful, but because they were human. They laughed, they cried, they dreamed, they struggled, and they endured, just like us. So the next time you see a photograph of a Victorian mansion, the next time you admire its beauty, take a moment to think about the invisible workforce that made it possible. Think about the young servant leaving home for the first time. Think about the maid climbing endless stairs before sunrise. Think about the cook working beside a hot stove long after everyone else had gone to bed. Think about the countless lives hidden behind the luxury. Because their story is not merely a footnote in history. It is one of the most important stories of the Victorian age. A story of sacrifice, a story of endurance, and a story that deserves to be remembered. Narration script. When we think about Victorian servants, we often imagine them working, cleaning hallways, preparing meals, polishing silver, serving wealthy families. But there is one question history rarely answers. What happened when their service ended? What happened after decades of hard work? What happened when they became too old to carry heavy buckets, climb endless stairs, and work 16-hour days? For many servants, the answer was heartbreaking. Unlike wealthy families, servants rarely accumulated great wealth. Their wages were modest. Their expenses were constant. Many spent years sending money home to support parents, brothers, and sisters. Others used their earnings simply to survive. By the time old age arrived, savings were often limited, and without significant savings, the future became uncertain. Imagine a woman who entered service at 13. She spends 40 years working in other people's homes, 40 years waking before dawn, 40 years serving meals she never ate, 40 years caring for households that were never truly hers. Now she is 53. Her body aches, her strength is fading. You might think such dedication would guarantee security. Often, it did not. Many elderly servants faced a difficult reality. As they aged, Employers sometimes preferred younger workers. Younger servants moved faster, worked longer hours, required lower wages. The qualities that once made an experienced servant valuable could gradually become disadvantages. Years of loyalty offered no guarantee of protection. Some servants remained with a single family for decades. When employers were generous, retirement could be comfortable. A loyal servant might receive a pension, a small room, financial assistance, or continued employment in lighter duties. These stories existed, but they were not universal. Many servants received far less support. For others, old age brought fear. Fear of unemployment, fear of poverty, fear of becoming dependent on charity. Victorian Britain provided limited assistance for the poor. Workhouses still existed, and for many people, the thought of ending their lives in a workhouse was terrifying. The workhouse represented desperation. Families could be separated. Conditions were harsh. Rules were strict. People entered only when they had exhausted other options. Many elderly servants feared this fate. After a lifetime of serving others, they hoped for something better. But hope and reality did not always match. Not every servant remained unmarried. Many eventually left service to start families. Marriage offered an opportunity to build a life outside domestic work. Yet marriage carried risks as well. A husband's illness, unemployment, or death could plunge a family back into poverty. For working-class families, financial security remained fragile. The lives of former servants often disappeared from historical records. Once they left service, society paid even less attention to them. They blended into the larger working population. Their stories became harder to trace. Their experiences faded from public memory. It is one reason historians struggle to reconstruct their lives today. The evidence is scattered, incomplete, and often silent. Yet, despite these challenges, former servants carried important skills. Years of domestic work taught discipline, organization, responsibility, problem-solving. Many women who later managed their own households relied on skills learned in service. The experience shaped generations, even when history failed to acknowledge it. As the 20th century approached, the world began changing rapidly. Electricity spread, modern appliances appeared, new jobs became available. Young women increasingly found opportunities beyond domestic service. The servant system that had dominated Victorian Britain slowly declined. A new era was emerging, an era with different possibilities, different expectations, and different futures. But while the profession changed, the lessons remained. Victorian servants helped build the foundations of modern society. They maintained homes, supported industries, raised children, and enabled wealthy families to pursue business, politics, and public life. Their labor influenced far more than their employers' households. It influenced an entire nation. Today, when people visit historic houses, they often admire the architecture, the furniture, the artwork, the luxury. But the most important story may not be found in any of those things. It may be found in the lives of the people who worked there. The people whose fingerprints once touched every door handle, every table, every staircase. People whose labor survives, even when their names do not. Think again about the young servant who left home as a child. The girl who walked toward an unfamiliar mansion, carrying only a few belongings. She did not know what the future held. She could not see the decades ahead, the sacrifices, the loneliness, the hard work, the strength she would need. Yet she continued, just as countless others did. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Victorian servants. Not wealth, not fame, not power, but resilience, the ability to endure difficult circumstances, the ability to keep moving forward despite hardship, the ability to survive in a world that often overlooked them. History may have forgotten many of their names, but it should not forget their contribution, because behind every grand Victorian home stood ordinary people doing extraordinary work, people who sacrificed comfort so others could enjoy it, people who gave their lives to service, people who helped shape an era. As the lights fade on the Victorian age, their voices still echo through history, in the quiet hallways, in the servants' staircases, in the kitchens hidden below magnificent dining rooms. They remind us that every great society depends not only on those who lead, but also on those who labor unseen. And for that reason, the story of Victorian servants deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote, not as a background detail, but as one of the defining human stories of the Victorian era. When visitors entered a Victorian mansion, they saw beauty, they saw polished furniture, golden candlelight, elegant carpets, magnificent staircases. Everything appeared calm. Everything appeared perfect. But beneath that perfection existed another world, a hidden world, a world most guests never saw, a world known simply as below stairs. The phrase below stairs was more than a location, it represented an entirely different society. While wealthy families lived upstairs, surrounded by comfort, servants spent most of their lives below. Separate dining rooms, separate staircases, separate entrances, separate rules. The distance between servant and employer was sometimes only a few meters. Yet socially, it felt like another universe. In many grand houses, servants used narrow back staircases that guests never noticed. These staircases allowed servants to move through the building without being seen. Architects designed entire homes around the idea of invisibility. The wealthy family occupied the stage. Servants worked behind the curtain. The less they were seen, the better. Imagine spending years in a house where your job is to remain unnoticed. You hear conversations, witness celebrations, observe family dramas, yet you are expected to act as though you are invisible. Your presence is required, your existence is ignored. For many servants, this became one of the strangest aspects of their lives. Some servants knew family secrets that outsiders never learned. They overheard arguments, financial troubles, marriage problems, private scandals. They witnessed moments that never appeared in newspapers or official records. Yet servants were expected to remain silent. Loyalty was part of the job. Keeping secrets was often essential. One careless conversation could ruin a reputation. Victorian society valued respectability above almost everything else. Families protected their image fiercely. Servants who shared private information risked dismissal. As a result, many carried secrets to their graves, stories that disappeared forever. The servant dining room revealed another hidden reality. After hours of serving food upstairs, servants gathered downstairs for their own meals. Here, away from employers, they could relax slightly. They could speak freely, law, complain, share stories. For a brief moment, they could simply be themselves. These moments were precious, because freedom was rare. Most of a servant's day belonged to someone else, their schedule, their duties, their responsibilities. Everything was controlled. Even free time often came with restrictions. Many servants developed strong friendships. Living and working together created deep bonds. These friendships helped people survive difficult circumstances. A kind word from another servant could make a hard day easier. A trusted friend could provide comfort during loneliness. In a world filled with rules, friendship became a form of support. But not every relationship was positive. Competition existed too. Promotions were limited. Higher positions meant better wages and greater respect. Servants sometimes competed for opportunities. Jealousy occasionally emerged. Arguments happened. The servant world reflected the complexities of human nature itself. Despite these challenges, servants created their own communities, their own traditions, their own culture. Below stairs was not simply a workplace. It was a social world filled with personalities, ambitions, and dreams. A world hidden from those upstairs. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that so few records survive from these lives. The wealthy documented their experiences. Servants rarely had that opportunity. Many stories vanished forever. Not because they lacked importance, but because nobody recorded them. Yet fragments remain. Old letters, employment records, personal diaries, newspaper reports. Together, they reveal a remarkable truth. Victorian servants were not background characters in history. They were human beings with complex lives, lives filled with courage, determination, and sacrifice. Today, when we walk through preserved Victorian houses, it is easy to focus on the grand rooms. But perhaps we should spend more time looking below stairs. Because that is where the real story often begins. Not in the ballroom, not in the drawing room, but in the kitchen, the laundry room, the servant corridor. The places where ordinary people performed extraordinary labor every single day. Their names may be forgotten, their faces may be lost to history, but their contribution remains. In every polished floor, every restored mansion, every surviving piece of Victorian history, the servants are still there, he in the details, waiting for their stories to be told.